The cold never lies. It preserves. It remembers. In the winter of 2019, Dr. Eleanor Vance stood at the threshold of a discovery that would consume the next 4 years of her life. She was 53 years old, a professor of architectural history at the University of Minnesota, and she had spent 3 decades believing she understood how buildings were made, how civilizations rose and fell, how stone was quarried and laid, how the past became the present through the slow accumulation of documented labor. She was wrong. The archive room in the basement of the Minnesota Historical Society smelled of dust and forgotten paper. Eleanor had requested access to a collection of photographs from the 1880s, images of St. Paul during its transformation from frontier outpost to metropolitan center. Standard research for a book she was writing about Gilded Age urban development. Nothing unusual. Nothing that should have altered the course of her understanding, but the photographs did not show what the records claimed they showed. The first image depicted the Minnesota State Capitol, not the current building, completed in 1905, but an earlier structure that Eleanor had never seen documented anywhere. The architecture was impossible. The dome rose in perfect mathematical proportion, its geometry suggesting calculations that exceeded anything in the contemporary engineering literature of that era. The columns were not Corinthian or Ionic or Doric. They followed no classical order she could identify. Instead, they seemed to spiral subtly upward, as if the stone itself had been grown rather than carved. Eleanor turned the photograph over. The handwriting on the back read simply, Capitol, 1847. But that was impossible. Minnesota wasn't even a territory until 1849. There was no Capitol building in 1847. There was, according to every historical record, nothing but wilderness and scattered trading posts. She pulled the next photograph from the stack. The image showed a railway station of extraordinary scale, a building that could have accommodated 1,000 passengers in its central hall. The ceiling was vaulted glass, supported by iron frameworks of delicate complexity. The photograph was dated 1852. The first railroad wouldn't reach Minnesota until 1862. Eleanor felt her hands begin to tremble. She was a rigorous scholar. She did not believe in mysteries. She believed in evidence, in documentation, in the slow, patient work of historical reconstruction. And yet the evidence before her contradicted everything she thought she knew. She spent the next 3 hours examining the collection. There were 47 photographs in total, each one depicting structures that predated their supposed construction by decades, sometimes by half a century. Grand hotels that appeared in images from 1840, when the region was supposedly uninhabited. Municipal buildings of sophisticated design photographed in 1855, labeled in handwriting that matched other authenticated documents from the period. The photographs were not forgeries. Eleanor had examined enough historical images to recognize the genuine article. The photographic techniques, the paper, the chemical composition of the developing process, everything indicated authenticity, which left only one possibility. The official history was incomplete. She gathered her notes and prepared to leave, her mind racing with questions she didn't yet know how to ask. As she reached the door, the archivist, a thin man in his 60s named Gerald, stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "You found the Hendricks collection," he said quietly. His voice carried a weight that made Eleanor pause. Most researchers don't notice it. The catalog entry is vague. Who was Hendricks? Gerald's eyes shifted toward the corridor as if checking for listeners. A surveyor. Worked for the railroad companies in the 1870s. He documented what he found on his expeditions, not what he was supposed to find, but what was actually there. What do you mean? I mean that when Hendricks arrived to survey routes for new rail lines, he kept encountering structures that were already built. Stations, depots, warehouses, sometimes entire complexes. The railroad companies would file reports claiming they had constructed these buildings, but Hendricks's photographs showed them standing years before construction supposedly began. Eleanor felt the floor shift beneath her feet, not physically, but conceptually. The ground of her understanding was no longer solid. Why isn't this public knowledge? Gerald smiled, but there was no humor in it. Dr. Vance, I've worked in this archive for 38 years. I've seen researchers come and go. Some of them find things that don't fit the accepted narrative. Most of them decide not to pursue it. The ones who do..." He paused. "The ones who do usually stop returning my calls after a few months." "Are you warning me?" "I'm informing you. What you do with the information is your choice." Eleanor left the archive that evening with photocopies of 12 images, all she could obtain without arousing suspicion. She drove home through the darkening streets of Minneapolis, past buildings she had walked by 1,000 times without really seeing them. Now she looked at them differently. The old flour mills along the river, the stone churches with their impossible spires, the downtown structures that seemed too grand, too precisely engineered for the rough-hewn frontier city that Minneapolis was supposed to have been in the 19th century. What if the city she knew was built on foundations she didn't understand? What if the past was not what she had been taught? The questions followed her home, into her sleep, into her dreams. She woke at 3 a.m. with a single phrase echoing in her mind, words she had seen in one of Hendrix's photographs, carved into the cornerstone of a building that officially never existed. Received from the Northern Authority, 1839. The Northern Authority. She had never encountered the term in any historical document. It appeared in no census records, no congressional reports, no newspaper archives. And yet there it was, carved in stone, photographed by a surveyor who had no reason to fabricate what he saw. Eleanor opened her laptop and began to search. The cold blue light of the screen illuminated her face as she typed query after query, following threads that led nowhere, dead ends that seemed almost deliberate in their opacity. By dawn, she had found nothing. But she had also found something: the pattern of absence itself. There were gaps in the historical record, not random omissions, but systematic erasures, building permits that referenced predecessor structures that had no documentation, land surveys that noted existing improvements on territory supposedly untouched by human development, insurance records that listed coverage for buildings that appeared in no city directory. The absence had a shape. The silence had a structure, and Eleanor Vance, who had spent her life believing that history was simply the past made visible, began to understand that some pasts were hidden not by accident, but by design. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Every week we uncover the stories that history tried to bury, the evidence that doesn't fit, the photographs that shouldn't exist, the questions that official narratives cannot answer. Subscribe now, because what we're about to reveal will change the way you see the world around you. 3 weeks after her discovery in the Minnesota archive, Eleanor received a letter. The envelope bore no return address. The postmark was smudged beyond legibility. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper, old paper, yellowed and brittle, on which someone had drawn a map. The map depicted the northern United States and southern Canada, from the Great Lakes to the Pacific coast. But the geography was wrong. Where the standard maps showed empty wilderness, this map showed cities, dozens of them, connected by lines that could only be transportation routes. The cities had names she did not recognize: Novopole, Tartarus Station, Crystalline Harbor, the Northern Seat. At the bottom of the map, in handwriting that matched the style of the 1840s, was a date, 1822, and below that, a warning. To those who seek what was erased, proceed with caution. Not all who search are meant to find. Not all who find are allowed to remember. Eleanor stared at the map for a long time. The rational part of her mind, the part trained by decades of academic rigor, insisted that this was a hoax. Someone had learned of her research and decided to play an elaborate prank. The map was a fabrication, a fantasy, a deliberate deception. But the paper was genuine. She had it tested at the university's materials science laboratory. The composition matched paper manufactured in the early 19th century. The ink showed chemical signatures consistent with period-appropriate iron gall formulations. The folds in the paper had been there for nearly 200 years. The map was real, which meant that either someone in 1822 had imagined a fictional geography and drawn it with meticulous precision for no apparent reason, or someone in 1822 had documented a geography that had since been erased from every official record. Eleanor's colleague, Professor Marcus Webb, found her in her office 3 days later, surrounded by stacks of old maps and survey documents. Marcus was 61, a historian of American expansion, and he had known Eleanor for 20 years. He trusted her judgment implicitly. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "I haven't," Eleanor admitted. "Not properly. Marcus, I need you to look at something." She showed him the photographs from the Hendricks collection. She showed him the map with its impossible cities. She walked him through the pattern of absences she had discovered, the systematic gaps in the historical record. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "Eleanor," he said finally, "do you remember the Sanborn maps?" The Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps were a standard resource for historians, detailed surveys of American cities created for insurance purposes, showing every building, its construction materials, its function. Eleanor had used them countless times. "Of course. Have you looked at the early Minnesota Sanborns? The ones from the 1880s? Not recently. Look at them. Look at what they show in areas that were supposedly undeveloped. And then..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Then look at what they don't show anymore." "What do you mean?" Marcus leaned forward. "I mean that the Sanborn maps have been revised. Multiple times. I noticed it years ago, but I never pursued it because I didn't know what to make of it. The versions in our university library don't match the versions in the Library of Congress, and neither of those match the originals I found in a private collection in Chicago. How is that possible? They're historical documents. Historical documents that someone has been systematically altering. Not the paper itself. The paper is original. But the content has been changed. Buildings have been removed. Street layouts have been modified. Entire blocks have been erased." Eleanor felt the same vertigo she had experienced in the archive basement. "Why would anyone do that?" "I don't know, but I know someone who might." Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card. The card was old, creased, the edges softened by years of handling. The only text was a name, Samuel Chen, and an address in Duluth. "Who is Samuel Chen?" "He was a cartographer, retired now, if he's still alive. He worked for the federal government for 40 years, specializing in historical map reconciliation. His job was to compare old surveys with modern satellite imagery and identify discrepancies. And he found too many. Discrepancies that couldn't be explained by surveying error or changing coastlines or urban development. He found evidence of structures that had been removed, not demolished but removed from the record, as if they had never existed. What happened to him?" Marcus's expression darkened. "He was retired early, mandatory. His research was classified. The last time I spoke to him, this was 15 years ago, he told me that he had made copies of everything. He said that someday someone would come looking for the truth, and he wanted to make sure the truth would be available to find." Eleanor took the card. The address was for a residential building in Duluth's Canal Park district. It was a 5-hour drive from Minneapolis. "You're going to go, aren't you?" Marcus asked. "I have to." "Eleanor, whatever you find, whatever this is, be careful. I've been in academia long enough to know that some research leads to dead ends. But I've also been around long enough to know that some research leads to places where people don't want you to go." She nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. The map, the photographs, the systematic erasures. The pattern was becoming clearer, even as its meaning remained obscure. That night, Eleanor dreamed of ice. Vast plains of white stretching to the horizon, broken by structures of impossible beauty, domes and spires and arched gateways that seemed to grow from the frozen earth itself. In the dream, she walked toward the nearest structure, her breath crystallizing in the air, and as she approached, she saw words carved above the entrance. "What was hidden will be revealed. What was silenced will speak again." She woke with the words still echoing in her mind and the taste of cold air in her throat. The drive to Duluth began before dawn. The route took her north through forests that had once been prairie, past lakes that had once been glaciers, along highways built on paths that human feet had walked for thousands of years. Eleanor had made this drive many times, but today the landscape looked different. She found herself noticing things she had never seen before. Stone foundations in the woods, too precisely cut to be natural. Clearings in the forest that formed perfect geometric shapes. Depressions in the earth that might have been cellars, or might have been something else entirely. She arrived in Duluth in the early afternoon. The city rose from the shore of Lake Superior like a monument to industrial ambition. Ore docks and grain elevators, bridges and warehouses, the remnants of a prosperity that had faded but never entirely disappeared. The address on Marcus's card led her to a converted warehouse near the waterfront. The building had been divided into loft apartments, and Samuel Chen's unit was on the top floor. Eleanor rang the bell and waited. The door opened to reveal a man who looked much older than his years. Small, thin, with white hair and eyes that held a depth of weariness she had rarely seen. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You're the one from Minnesota," he said. It was not a question. "How did you know?" "Because I've been waiting for someone like you for a very long time." He stepped aside to let her enter. "Come in, Dr. Vance. We have much to discuss." The apartment was filled with maps. They covered every wall, stacked on every surface, rolled into tubes that filled entire bookcases. Maps of the United States, of Canada, of territories Eleanor didn't recognize. Maps from different eras, different sources, different scales. And on every map, annotations in red ink, circles and arrows and question marks, notes in a cramped handwriting that covered margins and sometimes spilled onto the images themselves. 40 years, Samuel said, gesturing at the collection. 40 years of documenting what doesn't exist anymore, or rather, what the official records claim never existed. "The structures," Eleanor said. "The cities on the map I was sent." Samuel nodded slowly. "You've seen the 1822 survey. Good. That's a starting point. But there's much more." He moved to a desk covered with documents and selected a folder. "This is what they don't want you to know, Dr. Vance. This is what they've spent nearly 2 centuries trying to erase." He opened the folder and spread its contents across the desk. Eleanor looked down at photographs, drawings, survey documents, engineering reports. All of them depicted the same thing: structures of extraordinary sophistication, built in places that were supposedly wilderness, dated to periods when such construction should have been impossible. And all of them were located in one region, the area around the Great Lakes, extending north into Canada and west toward the Dakotas. The territory that was now covered, for much of the year, by snow and ice. "They built an empire here," Samuel said quietly. "Before there was supposed to be anyone here. Before the colonial period, before European settlement, before everything we think we know about American history. They built cities of stone and glass and metal, cities that use technologies we still don't fully understand. And then what?" Samuel's eyes met hers. In them, she saw decades of accumulated knowledge and decades of accumulated fear. And then something happened. Something catastrophic. Something that buried most of their civilization under ice. And the survivors, the people who came after, decided that the world would be better off forgetting. They rewrote history. They destroyed evidence. They created a new narrative, a simpler narrative, one that didn't include the uncomfortable truth of what came before. What truth? Samuel walked to the window and looked out at Lake Superior. The water stretched to the horizon, gray and cold and impossibly deep. The truth that we are not the first, that the civilization we call our own is built on the ruins of something older, something greater, something that was deliberately erased. The truth that beneath the ice, beneath the surface of the world we think we know, there are remnants of what was lost. He turned back to face her. And the truth that some people will do anything to keep that secret buried. 6 months later, Eleanor stood on the frozen shore of Lake Superior, watching the sun set over a landscape that seemed to belong to another world entirely. The expedition had taken everything she had. her savings, her academic reputation, her marriage, which had been fragile for years and finally shattered under the weight of her obsession. Her colleagues at the university had stopped returning her calls. The department chair had suggested, in terms that were polite but unmistakable, that perhaps she should consider early retirement. None of it mattered, not anymore. What mattered was the evidence, and the evidence was undeniable. Samuel Chen had died 3 months after their meeting. A heart attack, the official report said. Eleanor had attended the funeral, and afterward, she had retrieved the boxes he had left for her in a storage unit outside the city. The boxes contained 40 years of research, coordinates, measurements, photographs, witness statements. Everything he had gathered in his decades of work for the federal government, and everything he had kept hidden when they forced him out. The coordinates led her here, to a remote stretch of the northern Minnesota shore, where the forest met the water and the ice formed patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their geometry. She was not alone. Over the past 6 months, she had assembled a small team of people who had seen what she had seen, who had asked the questions she was asking. There was James Holloway, a retired engineer who had spent his career building structures and who recognized immediately that the buildings in the old photographs used techniques he couldn't explain. There was Dr. Sarah Kim, a geologist from Wisconsin, who had discovered anomalous rock formations beneath the sediment of Lake Superior, formations that suggested human modification. And there was Thomas Nightingale, a member of the Ojibwe Nation, whose grandfather had told stories of the old cities that existed before his people came to this land. "The ice has been retreating," Sarah said, pointing toward the shoreline. "Climate change. The lake doesn't freeze as thoroughly as it used to, and the permafrost inland is thawing. Things that have been buried for centuries are starting to emerge." "What kind of things?" Eleanor asked. "Come, I'll show you." They hiked inland for 2 hours, through forest so thick that the canopy blocked most of the fading sunlight. The air was cold, February in northern Minnesota, but the cold felt different here. Sharper, more ancient, as if the land itself remembered winters that no living human had experienced. The clearing appeared without warning. One moment they were pushing through dense underbrush. The next, they were standing at the edge of an open space perhaps 200 feet across. In the center of the clearing was a structure. It rose from the frozen earth like a geometric anomaly, a tower of dark stone, perhaps 30 feet tall, its surface covered with carved symbols that Eleanor didn't recognize. The tower was perfectly preserved, without any sign of weathering or decay. The stone seemed to absorb the last rays of sunlight, giving it an appearance of depth that made it hard to look at directly. "The ground shifted last spring," Sarah explained. "Heavy rains combined with snowmelt, the erosion exposed the top of the tower. It was completely buried before." "How old is it?" James asked, his voice hushed. "I did carbon dating on organic material trapped in the stone joints. The results came back." Sarah paused, as if she still couldn't believe what she was about to say. "The results came back indicating an age of approximately 12,000 years. Silence fell over the group. 12,000 years. That predated every accepted timeline for human construction in North America. That predated the pyramids of Egypt. That predated nearly everything. Thomas stepped forward, studying the carvings on the tower's surface. His expression was unreadable. "My grandfather spoke of these places," he said quietly. "He called them the speaking stones. He said they were built by the people who came before, not his people, not any people that history remembers. The ones who knew how to make the earth sing." "Make the earth sing?" Eleanor asked. Thomas placed his palm against the stone. A moment later, Eleanor heard it, or rather, felt it. A low vibration almost below the threshold of hearing that seemed to emanate from the tower itself. The vibration pulsed with a rhythm that was neither random nor mechanical. It felt intentional. "The resonance," James whispered. "The old engineering texts I found in the archive, they mentioned something called resonance architecture. Buildings designed to harness and amplify natural vibrations. I thought it was theoretical. I didn't think anyone had actually built it. They built more than this, Sarah said. My ground-penetrating radar surveys show structures extending for miles beneath the surface. This tower is just the tip. There's an entire complex down there, streets, buildings, what might be a central gathering hall, all of it preserved under the ice. Eleanor felt her heart racing. Everything Samuel had told her, everything she had found in the archives, everything that had cost her career and her marriage and her place in the academic world, it was all true. The evidence was right here in front of her, carved in stone that had endured for 12 millennia. We need to document everything, she said. Photographs, measurements, samples. We need to build a case that no one can dismiss. Eleanor. James's voice carried a warning. Look. He was pointing toward the edge of the clearing, where the forest met the open space. Figures were emerging from the trees, men in dark clothing, moving with purpose and precision. 6 of them, spreading out to encircle the group. Dr. Vance! The voice came from behind her. She turned to find a 7th figure, a woman in her 40s, professionally dressed despite the wilderness setting, her expression coldly neutral. My name is Director Morrison. I represent an agency that oversees matters of historical significance. You and your colleagues need to come with me. We're on public land, Eleanor said, fighting to keep her voice steady. We have every right to be here. You're on land that has been classified as a restricted research zone since 1947. You are conducting unauthorized investigation of protected archaeological materials, and you are in possession of documents that were illegally removed from government archives. The woman's smile held no warmth. I'm not asking, Dr. Vance. I'm informing you of the situation. Eleanor glanced at her companions. Thomas's face was set with quiet determination. Sarah looked frightened but resolute. James was already calculating options, his engineer's mind searching for solutions. What happens if we refuse? Then we proceed differently. But I don't think you want that, Dr. Vance. I don't think any of you want that. The men in dark clothing moved closer. Eleanor could see now that they were armed, not with guns, but with devices she didn't recognize. The technology looked wrong, somehow. Too smooth. Too precisely designed. As if it had been manufactured according to principles she didn't understand. What are you protecting? Eleanor asked. What are you so afraid people will find? Director Morrison's expression flickered. Just for a moment. A shadow of something that might have been doubt or might have been pain. Then the mask returned. We're protecting order, Dr. Vance. We're protecting the stability of a world that functions because people believe certain things about their history. You've seen what's under the ice. You've seen the evidence of what existed before. Now imagine what would happen if everyone saw it. Imagine the chaos, the upheaval, the collapse of every assumption that holds civilization together. People deserve to know the truth. People deserve to live in peace. Sometimes those two things are incompatible. Morrison gestured to her team. Take them. Gently, if possible. We're not savages. The men moved forward, and then Thomas began to sing. The song was in a language Eleanor didn't recognize, not Ojibwe, not any indigenous language she had heard before. The words seemed to vibrate in the air itself, harmonizing with the pulse from the tower, and as Thomas sang, the tower responded. The vibration grew stronger. The carvings on the stone began to glow with a faint luminescence that intensified with each passing second. The ground beneath their feet trembled. Morrison's team stopped, uncertainty replacing their professional composure. One of them reached for his weapon, but before he could act, the tower released a pulse of sound, a single resonant note that swept across the clearing like a wave. The men in dark clothing collapsed. Morrison staggered but remained standing, her face white with shock. What did you do? Thomas stopped singing. His eyes were closed, and when he opened them, they held a peace that seemed out of place in the chaos of the moment. The old ones built more than buildings, he said. They built protection. They knew that someday people would come trying to silence what they created, so they made sure that some things cannot be silenced. Eleanor looked at the tower, still glowing softly in the twilight. The vibration had subsided, but she could still feel it, a presence, an awareness as if the stone itself was watching. "The complex below," Sarah whispered. "If this is just an entrance, if the whole system is connected—" "It is," Thomas confirmed. "The old ones didn't build isolated structures, they built networks, resonance networks that span the entire continent. This tower is connected to hundreds of others. Some buried, some destroyed, some still standing in places no one thinks to look. And when one speaks, the others listen." Morrison was backing toward the trees, her composure finally broken. "This isn't over," she said, her voice shaking. "You have no idea what you've awakened. No idea what forces you're dealing with." "We know enough," Eleanor replied. "We know that you've spent centuries hiding the truth. We know that the truth is bigger than your lies. And we know that the ice is melting, Director. Whatever you buried is coming back, whether you want it to or not." Morrison disappeared into the forest, leaving her unconscious team behind. Eleanor turned to her companions. In their faces, she saw exhaustion, fear, exhilaration, and something else. Something that looked like hope. "We need to move," James said. "They'll send more people. We can't stay here." "Where do we go?" Sarah asked. Thomas pointed north. "There's another site. 2 days' travel through the forest. My grandfather showed me the way when I was a boy. It's where the networks converge, what the old ones called the Northern Seat. If we can reach it, we'll find answers. And protection." Eleanor nodded. The cold bit at her face, and somewhere in the distance, she heard the howl of wind across the frozen lake. But she felt no fear, only determination. And beneath that, a growing certainty that everything she had lost, her career, her marriage, her place in the world she had known, had been the price of finding something infinitely more valuable: the truth. If this moment resonated with something deep inside you, if you feel the pull of hidden histories and buried truths, leave a comment right now saying, "The ice remembers." Those 3 words will connect you with thousands of others who refuse to accept the official story. Say it with us. The ice remembers. Chapter 4. The Northern Seat. The journey through the frozen wilderness took 3 days, not 2. The first day they moved quickly, putting distance between themselves and the clearing where they had encountered Director Morrison and her team. Thomas led the way with an unerring sense of direction that seemed to operate independent of compass or map, navigating through forest so dense that Eleanor lost all sense of orientation within the first hour. The second day, the snow began. It fell in curtains so thick that visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. The temperature plummeted. James's face turned gray with cold, and Sarah developed a cough that worried Eleanor deeply. Only Thomas seemed unaffected, his pace never slowing, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance that no one else could see. "How much farther?" Eleanor asked during one of their brief rest stops, huddled beneath a rock overhang that offered minimal protection from the wind. "Close now," Thomas replied. "The land is waking up. It knows we're coming." Eleanor wanted to ask what he meant, but exhaustion had drained her capacity for questions. She simply nodded and forced herself back to her feet when he indicated it was time to continue. The third day, the forest ended. They emerged onto a plateau that stretched to the horizon, a vast plain of ice and snow, broken only by the occasional outcropping of dark stone. The wind had died, and in the silence that followed, Eleanor heard something extraordinary. Not the mechanical sound of instruments, but something organic, something that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The melody was simple, 3 notes repeated in patterns of varying complexity, but it carried an emotional weight that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. "The Northern Seat," Thomas said, his voice reverent. "This is where the networks converge. This is where the old ones held their councils, where they made decisions that shaped the continent. This is where they gathered when the catastrophe came." "What catastrophe?" James asked. Thomas was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, His voice carried the weight of inherited memory, stories passed from generation to generation, preserved through millennia of oral tradition. The sky burned, the earth shook, the waters rose and then froze. It happened in a single season, a winter that lasted decades, that buried everything the old ones had built. Most of them died. The survivors scattered, carrying what knowledge they could, trying to preserve what remained. My ancestors were among them. We have carried the memory ever since, waiting for the time when the ice would retreat and the truth would be revealed. He pointed toward the center of the plateau, where a shape was emerging from the snow. As they approached, the shape resolved into a structure, a building of such scale that Eleanor's mind struggled to comprehend it. The northern seat was not a tower or a temple, it was a city. Frozen in time, preserved beneath a sheet of ice that had protected it from weathering and decay, the city spread across the plateau like a geometric garden. The buildings were constructed of the same dark stone as the tower they had found earlier, their surfaces covered with the same intricate carvings. But where the tower had been a single structure, the northern seat was an interconnected complex of hundreds of buildings, all oriented toward a central structure that rose from the heart of the settlement like a frozen flame. "The resonance hall," Thomas said, pointing to the central building. "That's where the networks converge. That's where we'll find answers." They made their way through the silent streets, past buildings that seemed to watch them with patient awareness. The ice had cracked in places, revealing glimpses of interiors, spaces that still held furniture, tools, artifacts of daily life. Eleanor saw what looked like a workshop filled with instruments she couldn't identify. She saw a library where shelves held objects that might have been books but were made of materials she had never encountered. She saw a hall filled with what appeared to be maps, not paper maps, but three-dimensional representations carved from translucent stone, showing geographical features that didn't match any modern continent. "The ice didn't just bury them," Sarah murmured, her scientific detachment giving way to wonder. "It preserved them. Everything. Exactly as it was when the catastrophe struck." "The old ones understood ice," Thomas explained. "They knew how to use it, how to work with it. When the catastrophe came, they made a choice. They couldn't save themselves. Not all of them, not most of them. But they could save what they had built. They used their knowledge to freeze themselves in time, to wait for an age when the world would be ready to remember." "And that age is now?" James asked. Thomas looked up at the sky, where the sun hung low on the horizon. "The ice is melting. The land is waking. The networks are beginning to resonate again after 12,000 years of silence. Yes, that age is now." They reached the resonance hall as the sun touched the edge of the plateau. The building's entrance was a massive arch, carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change as Eleanor watched. Optical illusions created by the interplay of light and shadow, she told herself, even as some deeper part of her mind suggested otherwise. Inside, the hall was vast, a cathedral of ice and stone, with a ceiling so high that it disappeared into shadow. The floor was composed of concentric circles, each ring made of a different material. Stone, metal, crystal, substances that Eleanor couldn't identify. At the center of the circles stood a structure that made her breath catch in her throat. It was a throne, but not a throne for sitting. The structure was more like a framework, a lattice of crystal and metal shaped to accommodate a human body in a standing position. From the framework, hundreds of thin filaments extended outward, connecting to channels in the floor that ran toward the walls and beyond. "The resonance interface," Thomas said. "The old ones didn't rule through force or wealth. They ruled through connection. The person who stood in the interface became a conduit, a living link between the resonance networks. They could feel every node in the system, communicate with communities across the continent, sense disturbances and imbalances before they became crises." "That's impossible," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "It's technology," James corrected, moving closer to examine the framework. "Different technology than we're used to based on different principles, but technology nonetheless. The old ones understood something about resonance, about vibration, about the fundamental frequencies that underlie matter and energy. They built their civilization around that understanding. And we forgot, Eleanor said quietly. We forgot everything they knew. We were made to forget, Thomas corrected. The survivors, some of them decided that the old knowledge was dangerous, that it had been responsible for the catastrophe. They believed that humanity needed to start over without the burden of what came before. So they erased the evidence. They rewrote the histories. They created a new narrative, a simpler narrative, one that didn't include the uncomfortable truth of our origins. The people Morrison works for, Eleanor realized, they're the descendants of those survivors. They've been maintaining the erasure for 12,000 years. Longer than any nation, Thomas agreed. Longer than any empire. The guardians of forgetting. They call themselves different names in different eras, work through different institutions, adapt to changing circumstances. But their mission has never changed, to keep the old truth buried, to prevent humanity from remembering what it once was. Why? Sarah demanded. Why would anyone work that hard to suppress knowledge? Because knowledge is power, a new voice said. They turned. Director Morrison stood in the entrance to the hall, flanked by a dozen agents. But something had changed. Her professional composure had cracked, revealing something raw and desperate beneath. You don't understand what you're dealing with, she continued, her voice unsteady. The old ones weren't just advanced. They weren't just sophisticated. They were connected. To each other, to the earth, to forces that modern science doesn't even acknowledge. And that connection drove them mad. Mad, Eleanor repeated. The resonance networks weren't just communication systems. They were consciousness systems. The old ones didn't just share information, they shared thoughts, feelings, memories. They became a collective entity, a single mind distributed across millions of bodies. And when that mind grew too large, too complex, too aware of its own existence, Morrison shuddered. It turned on itself. The catastrophe wasn't a natural disaster. It was suicide. The old ones destroyed themselves because they couldn't bear the weight of their own consciousness. Silence fell over the hall. That's why we guard the forgetting, Morrison said, her voice almost pleading now. Not because we want to suppress knowledge, but because we want to protect humanity from making the same mistake. The resonance networks are still there, still waiting to be activated. If someone were to reestablish the connections, to rebuild the collective consciousness, she gestured toward the crystal framework. It would happen again. The madness, the destruction, the end of everything. Eleanor looked at the resonance interface, at the filaments extending to every corner of the ancient city, at the symbols carved into the walls that seemed to pulse with latent energy. She thought about everything she had learned, everything she had lost, everything she had hoped to find. And she made her choice. Thomas, she said, what happens if someone enters the interface? Thomas's eyes widened. Eleanor, you can't. What happens? The networks would recognize a new conduit. They would begin to resonate again, to rebuild the connections that have been dormant for millennia. The old one's knowledge would flow into the conduit's mind, their memories, their understanding, their wisdom. He paused, but also their pain, their grief, the weight of everything they lost. Could someone survive it? I don't know. No one has tried in 12,000 years. Eleanor turned to face Morrison. You've spent millennia protecting humanity from a mistake that might not have been a mistake at all. You've kept us isolated, disconnected, fragmented, and look where that's led. Wars, destruction, the systematic ruination of the planet. Maybe the old ones weren't destroyed by connection. Maybe they were destroyed by fear of it. Maybe the madness came from trying to resist the very thing that made them great. She stepped toward the resonance interface. Eleanor, please, Morrison begged. You have no idea what you're risking. I know exactly what I'm risking. Eleanor placed her hand on the crystal framework. Immediately she felt it. A vibration, a presence, a vast and ancient awareness reaching toward her across the gulf of millennia. I'm risking everything, but I'm also risking nothing, because the world you've been protecting isn't worth protecting anymore. It's time for humanity to remember. She stepped into the interface. The world exploded into light. Eleanor felt her consciousness expand, not metaphorically but literally, as if the boundaries of her mind were suddenly permeable, suddenly capable of containing multitudes. She was herself, standing in the crystal framework in the resonance hall, feeling the cold touch of ancient technology against her skin. But she was also something else, something larger, something that extended in all directions through networks she was only beginning to perceive. She saw the old ones, not as ghosts or memories, but as imprints, patterns of consciousness preserved in the resonance networks like fossils in amber. They were still there, 12,000 years after the catastrophe, waiting in the space between frequencies for someone to hear them. And now she could hear. The voices came in waves, first a trickle, then a flood, then an ocean of experience and knowledge and emotion that threatened to overwhelm her entirely. She felt their joy at the height of their civilization, their pride in what they had built, their wonder at the interconnectedness of all things. She felt their fear as the catastrophe approached, their grief as they watched everything they loved begin to die. She felt their determination as they encoded themselves into the networks, choosing to wait rather than to perish completely. And she felt their hope. The hope that someday someone would come, that the ice would retreat, that the networks would awaken, that humanity would be ready to remember. "Eleanor," came a voice that was not a voice, more like a thought impressed directly into her awareness. "You have found us. After so long, after so much silence, you have found us." "Who are you?" Eleanor asked, though her lips didn't move. "We are what remains of the old ones. We are the memory of what was. We are the seed of what might yet be. Morrison said you destroyed yourselves. She said the collective consciousness drove you mad. Laughter, or something like laughter, warm and sad and infinitely patient. Morrison's ancestors understood only part of the truth. Yes, there was destruction. Yes, there was pain. But not because of the connection, because of the breaking of the connection. I don't understand. The voices, Eleanor realized, millions of them speaking in harmony, showed her instead of telling her. She saw the old ones at the height of their power, their consciousness linked through networks that spanned the continent. She saw them make discoveries that transcended anything modern science had achieved, not through technology alone, but through the combination of technology and expanded awareness. She saw them build cities that resonated with the fundamental frequencies of the earth, heal illnesses by adjusting the vibrations of living tissue, communicate across vast distances through the medium of consciousness itself. And then she saw the schism. A faction arose among the old ones, those who believed that the collective consciousness was a threat to individual identity, that the interconnection was erasing the boundaries that made each person unique. They argued for dissolution, for a return to isolated awareness, for the rebuilding of walls between minds. The debate grew bitter, families divided, communities fractured. The resonance networks, designed to harmonize consciousness, began to carry discord instead. And then the faction acted. They built a device. Eleanor saw it clearly. A structure of crystal and metal not unlike the resonance interface, but designed for the opposite purpose. Instead of connecting, it severed. Instead of harmonizing, it disrupted. They activated it without warning, without preparation, without understanding the consequences. The networks shattered. Millions of minds, suddenly isolated after generations of connection, experienced a trauma beyond description. The shock killed many instantly. Others descended into madness, unable to cope with the sudden silence where there had been endless conversation. The earth itself responded to the disruption, releasing energies that had been carefully balanced by the resonance networks: earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, catastrophic climate shifts. The ice came not as a natural disaster, but as a symptom of the unraveling. The survivors who remained, those who had been on the margins of the network, whose connection was less complete, faced a choice. They could try to rebuild what was lost, knowing that the factionalists might strike again. Or they could accept the new reality, embrace the isolation, and work to prevent anyone from ever attempting reconnection. They chose the latter. The guardians of forgetting are our children, the voices told Eleanor. They inherited our fear. They turned it into a mission. They have protected the world from connection for 12,000 years, believing that isolation is safety. But isolation is not safety. Isolation is slow death. Humanity has been dying since the networks fell, dying of loneliness, dying of disconnection, dying of the inability to truly understand each other. "What do you want from me?" Eleanor asked. "We want you to choose. The networks are awakening. The ice is melting. The old connections are becoming possible again. You stand at the interface, the first human in millennia to touch the resonance framework. You can complete the awakening, restore the networks, reconnect humanity, heal the wound that has been bleeding for 12,000 years. Or you can withdraw, leave the networks dormant, preserve the isolation, let the guardians continue their work. What happens if I complete the awakening? Humanity will remember, not all at once. The reconnection will take time, generations perhaps, but the process will begin. People will start to feel each other, to understand each other, to recognize the fundamental unity beneath the surface differences. The loneliness will end, the healing will begin. And the madness, the destruction? There is always risk. Every choice carries the possibility of failure. But the old ones did not fall because of connection. We fell because some of us could not accept it. If humanity chooses connection, truly chooses it, with understanding and intention, then the outcome can be different. Eleanor felt the weight of the decision pressing on her consciousness. She thought about her life, the isolation of academia, the failure of her marriage, the loneliness that had followed her even in the company of others. She thought about the world, the wars, the hatred, the systematic inability of human beings to recognize each other's humanity. And she thought about her team waiting in the hall below. Sarah and James and Thomas, who had followed her into the frozen wilderness because they believed that truth was worth pursuing, that knowledge was worth having, that connection was worth the risk. "Complete the awakening," she said. The light intensified. Eleanor felt the network surge to life, not just in the northern seat, but across the continent, across the world. Ancient nodes that had been dormant for millennia began to resonate. The earth itself seemed to hum with returning consciousness. And in that moment, Eleanor understood everything. She understood that the old ones had not been gods or demigods or supernatural beings. They had been human in ways that modern humanity had forgotten. They had discovered that consciousness was not confined to individual brains, that awareness was a field phenomenon, that connection was the natural state of existence and isolation the aberration. She understood that the guardians of forgetting had been wrong, not evil, but wrong. They had mistaken trauma for truth, fear for wisdom. They had tried to protect humanity by denying humanity its birthright. And she understood that the awakening she had begun was not an ending, but a beginning. The networks would take time to rebuild. Humanity would take time to adapt. There would be resistance, confusion, pain, but there would also be healing. The light faded. Eleanor opened her eyes. She was still standing in the resonance interface, but everything had changed. She could feel the others now. Sarah and James and Thomas, their consciousnesses brushing against hers like familiar voices in a crowded room. She could feel Morrison and her agents, their fear and confusion giving way to something that might eventually become wonder. And beyond them, faint but unmistakable, she could feel the stirring of millions of other minds, people across the world, feeling the first tremors of a connection they didn't yet understand. "What did you do?" Morrison whispered. Eleanor stepped out of the interface. Her body felt different, lighter, more present, more connected to the earth beneath her feet and the air around her. "I remembered," she said. "I remembered what humanity used to be, what we still can be." She looked at her team, at the agents, at the ancient city preserved in ice. The awakening has begun. There's no stopping it now. But we can shape it. We can guide it. We can make sure that what happened before doesn't happen again. Morrison's face was unreadable. The Guardians will resist. Some will, others won't. You've felt it.